Among the hills of Bethany, where the sun seems to set more slowly and the stones hold ancient secrets, a man crossed the line between life and death, and returned not as a myth, not as a legend, but as a witnessed fact, written, preserved, and feared for generations. This is the story of Lazarus. Not the version you heard from the pulpit, nor the one told by tradition, but the silent story, the hidden story, the story of a man who knew death from the inside and was never the same again. Why did Jesus wait 4 days to act? What did Lazarus see on the other side? And why did he never speak of it? And most unsettling, why did those who celebrated the miracle later decide to kill him? There is a hidden truth behind this episode that changed faith, politics, and the destiny of many. It's not just about a miracle, it's about identity, fear, and redemption, and the echo of a life that refused to be silenced, not even by the grave. Before we dive into this journey, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any of the hidden and transformative stories of the Bible. Now then, let's continue. The whisper of sickness. John 11:1. The heat in Bethany rose slowly, dissolving into the stones of the humble homes and the sheets drying in the wind. The olive trees swayed gently, and the smell of fresh bread escaped through the cracks. Everything seemed ordinary. Everything seemed alive. But inside Lazarus's house, something invisible was being announced like a muffled whisper no one wanted to hear. He awoke with cold sweat running down his forehead. A chill ran down his spine, even though the sun hadn't yet touched the ground. Mary watched him in silence, eyes fixed on every movement of her brother. It wasn't fatigue. It wasn't just a fever. It was something unnamed, but it left a dense trace in the air. Martha, noticing the change in both their expressions, ran out. Someone had to go to Jerusalem. Someone had to find the rabbi. The sickness didn't arrive like a storm. It didn't scream. It didn't seize Lazarus's body all at once. It came like a patient thief. A constant weight on the chest, a slowness in his movements, a strange weariness in his eyes. And the more he tried to deny it, the more time betrayed him. Mary began to pray, long hours on her knees. She whispered the Psalms with her lips almost touching the floor, as if she could reach God's will through the dust. Martha, for her part, never stopped. She made herbal infusions, searched for doctors, and begged for answers no one had. But nothing changed. The home that once echoed with laughter and visits now breathed in silence, tense like the moment before thunder. Days passed. Lazarus's gaze dimmed. He no longer stood on his own. He barely ate. His body trembled and his mind seemed absent between reality and a growing void. At night, Mary stayed awake beside her brother, her hand on his chest, making sure he was still breathing. At each muffled moan, she closed her eyes tightly as if trying to stop the pain from becoming real. "Where is he?" Martha murmured deep in the house, staring at the empty road. "Why hasn't he come yet?" The message had already been sent. The words were clear. "Lord, the one you love is sick." It was Lazarus, the friend, the one who walked beside the Messiah, the one who laughed with him under the fig trees. How could Jesus, the rabbi of miracles, not respond? Bethany began to whisper. Neighbors started to avoid the house, not out of scorn, but out of fear. It was common for a silent sickness to take an entire family, and although no one said it aloud, the air carried that ancient omen. He is marked to die. Mary kept praying, but now her voice was a silent plea. She no longer prayed for healing. She prayed for presence. She asked that the Master at least look into Lazarus's eyes, at least take his hand, at least be there. Time, however, remained relentless. The pain deepened. Lazarus's skin grew pale. His once bright eyes stared at a fixed point on the wall, as if he saw something beyond the visible. Sometimes he smiled faintly. Other times he cried for no reason. Martha said it was the fever. Mary said it was the soul trying to let go. Then came the night when he spoke no more. He only looked at Mary, took her hand with what little strength he had left, and blinked slowly like an unspoken goodbye. She knew without a word. She knew. Martha cried, not out of despair, but indignation. She had done everything she had asked, searched, trusted, and now there before her, the brother she loved was being taken by something she couldn't stop. The ground of Bethany seemed to collapse beneath her feet. Meanwhile, Jesus remained distant. The moon lit Lazarus's face, now so thin, as pale as the linen that covered him. The morning songs hadn't started yet. The weeping hadn't filled the streets. But inside that house, time had already stopped. The whisper had become a scream, though no sound accompanied it. In that moment, between sighs and tears, between promises and silence, a question floated in the air like unfinished incense. Why didn't he come? The silence of the Master. The messenger galloped through the dusty hills, carrying the urgent plea from the sisters of Bethany. His robe clung to his body, his mouth dry from the sun and haste. The message was short, direct, burning like a cry. Lord, the one you love is sick. Outside, the world kept its rhythm, harvests, offerings, travels. But in Bethany, time shattered between the sound of Lazarus's coughs and Martha's desperate footsteps going back and forth from the darkened room. Mary no longer spoke. She only watched the horizon as if she could see the rabbi descending the path in the breath of the wind. But the sky remained silent, and the road empty. Where Jesus rested with his disciples, the sun hadn't yet reached its zenith when the message arrived. The air was cool. The men looked at each other expecting an immediate reaction, a movement, anything. But Jesus didn't rise. He didn't order them to leave. He only lowered his gaze as if listening to another voice, one that no one else could hear. Hours passed, then days, and in Bethany, the waiting became a blade. He will come, Martha repeated, trying to convince herself. He always comes. But faith began to bend under the weight of absence. Every sunrise was a disappointment, every sunset a blow. The road remained the same, but Jesus did not appear. Mary finally fell silent even in her prayers. She sat beside her brother, softly singing verses from the scroll of Isaiah, not for hope, but for comfort. Lazarus's eyes stayed moist, as if trying to cling to life through his sister's tears. He knows, Martha murmured. He knows what's happening. But the question was inevitable, and if he knows, why doesn't he come? Faith in Bethany didn't die with shouts. It died in silence, a silence that seemed to come from heaven and echoed in the bones. Martha looked toward the distant city, feeling the distance like cold inside her chest. Jerusalem was only a few kilometers away, but it felt like an eternity separated the Messiah from the sick friend, and still nothing. Lazarus worsened. He no longer recognized voices. Sometimes he smiled at shadows no one else saw. Other times he moaned in tongues that didn't belong to Bethany from the abyss. And Mary, ever more silent, watched, dry-eyed, heart in ruins. People began to talk. Some said Jesus had forgotten, others that he had more important things to do. Still others in even lower whispers suggested that perhaps his love wasn't what everyone thought, that maybe Lazarus wasn't that special. After all, those words reached Martha's ears like poison, but she didn't reply. She only clenched her fists, holding her soul so it wouldn't shatter alongside her brother's body. Then on the fourth evening, when hope had already hidden in the corners of the house, Mary quietly asked, "If he doesn't come, does he still love us?" The question floated in the air like black smoke, and no one dared to extinguish it. Across the Jordan River, Jesus looked to the sky. His silence was not neglect. It was waiting. But who could understand that? The disciples were restless too. They wanted to go to do something, anything. But the Master only said, "This sickness is not unto death, but for the glory of God." But in Bethany, Lazarus was dying, and with him the trust of a people tired of waiting was dying too. That night Martha didn't light any lamps. She sat in the dimness. Mary slept beside her brother, exhausted, and Lazarus. Lazarus breathed like someone saying goodbye wordlessly. Outside, the cicadas sang as always. The world didn't stop, But inside that house everything was suspended as if even time was waiting for an answer. But the sky remained silent and Bethany still waited. If you haven't done it yet, this is the perfect moment to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share with someone who needs to hear this message. Every gesture helps keep this purpose alive. Let's continue our journey. The last breath, John 11:14. Time was breaking into slow seconds. The air in Bethany was heavy, as if heaven itself were holding its breath. Martha and Mary's house was no longer a home. It was a limbo between life and death. Lazarus's body, pale and soaked in sweat, trembled like a flame about to go out. Every groan sounded like a farewell, every sigh like a final effort to remain. The silence was not just the absence of sound. It was a dense presence, a cruel one. Neither Martha nor Mary spoke anymore. Hope. The hope Martha had tried to keep alive like embers in her hands was now only ashes. Lazarus hadn't eaten in days. His gaze was lost in a point no one else could see. His lips moved occasionally, whispering something inaudible. Mary leaned in to listen, but only heard the sound of her own heart breaking. In the room, the dimness was thick. A damp cloth rested on the sick man's forehead. The scent of myrrh and aloe prepared in advance already floated in the air as if death were an expected guest. Martha watched her brother's breathing, counting the intervals. Longer and longer, fainter and fainter. Some neighbors had gathered in the courtyard. The elders murmured prayers. Others prepared cloths and jars of water. The murmuring of the village, the sound of sandals dragging on the ground, the crunch of leaves under the dry afternoon heat. Everything seemed to conspire against peace because there was no peace. Only sharp waiting. "He's not coming," Mary murmured, eyes fixed on the door. "He's not coming." Martha didn't reply. It was no longer a day for questions. Lazarus's eyes opened one last time slowly, like heavy curtains lifting just enough for a final glimpse. His chest arched. A sound escaped his throat, something between a breath and a plea. And then silence. It was as if the world stopped. Mary screamed, not loudly. A scream caught suffocated. A pain that didn't cross her lips, but cut from within. Martha ran to the body, pressed her brother's chest, searched for a pulse, for breath. Nothing. Only stillness. Only the end. The sun disappeared behind the hills as Lazarus's last breath faded. Bethany came to a halt. The women of the village approached respectfully. Martha's eyes were dry. She didn't cry. Not yet. There was something deep in her chest that didn't move. Not pain, not anger, just the weight of loss, the weight of divine silence. Mary fell to her knees. Her fingers touched her brother's cold feet. She no longer cried out. The tears rolled silently, tracing ancient paths down her face. She was the sister who had prayed in hope, who believed in the improbable, who trusted to the end. And now Lazarus lay before her. And Jesus had not come. Night fell, candles were lit. The body was washed with care. Martha prepared him with steady hands as if each gesture were an act of love and defiance. Love for her brother. Defiance against the silence of heaven. "He loved Lazarus," someone whispered. But he didn't come. The comment was quick, but cutting like a copper blade in the dark. Martha didn't respond. Mary did with the deepest silence she had ever carried. That night, Lazarus's room became a tomb. The windows were closed, the cloths tied, the body wrapped. The scent of perfumes filled the halls. Bethany began its mourning. The men began to dig. A tomb carved into the rock just a few steps from the house. The same place where others had been buried before, but now it carried a different weight. The tomb of a friend of Jesus, the tomb of someone loved by him and who still died without seeing him come. Mary didn't eat. Martha quietly organized tasks. The neighbors' weeping echoed like bitter music. And at the center of the pain, only one question lingered, unspoken. Why didn't he come? The room was now empty. Only the scent of the sheets remained. The echo of Lazarus's last words and a space where life once was. Martha rested her head against the wall and closed her eyes. When she opened them, She saw the sky through a crack. No stars, no sign. And for the first time she murmured, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." But there was no answer. And that night, Bethany slept with death, and the sky once again remained silent. The tomb. Lazarus's body had been prepared before sunset. The village women, covered in dark veils, moved with precision and reverence. Every step, every gesture followed an ancient rite, as if their hands knew by tradition what the soul still resisted accepting. Martha and Mary, though devastated, took part. Lazarus was not just the dead. He was their brother, their home, their story. He was the one Jesus loved, the promise of eternal life against the dominion of death. The stone was completely removed. The dark opening lay open. And for a moment, everything hung in suspense. Jesus looked up. "Father, I thank you for hearing me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the sake of the people standing here, that they may believe you sent me." No one understood right away, but heaven heard. Hell trembled. The stone symbol of confinement now became a stage for glory. Death had been challenged, but the impossible still remained. The body was still there. Lazarus inside lay wrapped in grave clothes. The flesh had already yielded to time. The eyes were closed, the heart still, the nerves undone. It was the end. But there, in front of that open hole, something began to change. Time seemed to stand still. The air vibrated with an invisible tension. Jesus stepped forward, and then he shouted the shout. John 11:43-44. The silence was absolute. No leaf stirred, no bird sang. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The tomb's opening portrayed the abyss between worlds. The black hole in the rock seemed to devour all hope like a hungry mouth that would never be satisfied. The crowd watched, immersed in awe and fear. Jesus stepped forward. His feet touched the dust at the entrance of the grave, and then he shouted, "Lazarus, come out." It was not a pious whisper nor a murmured prayer. It was a command, a decree, a voice that didn't just cut through the air but pierced the fabric of the invisible. The vibration of that cry seemed to carry the echo of Genesis, as if the same voice that said, "Let there be light," now roared against the chaos of death. The sound reverberated through the stones. It entered the tomb. It touched the corpse's wrappings. And within the silence of the dead, something moved. No one noticed at first. Some looked around, thinking it might be a metaphor, a symbolic gesture. Others frowned, but a chill ran over the skin of those present. A chill not from the cold, but from something deeper, spiritual. Inside the darkness, the impossible was happening. A finger, a muscle, an eye beneath the wrapping. The flesh which had begun to rot was being restored. The blood began to flow again. The soul torn from the other side was returned by the one who holds the keys to life and death. Lazarus breathed with effort. Withered lungs expanded. Air rushed in like a creative breath. The body's stiffness gave way. The burial wrappings tightened around limbs now alive. The heartbeat, first with pain, then with strength, and then between darkness and light. Lazarus rose slowly. Like someone walking between two times, he took his first steps. His feet bound, sought balance. His arms restrained, trembled. Yet he moved forward. He obeyed. He walked. The people's eyes widened. A cry caught in their throats refused to come out. It was him, Lazarus, the dead man, alive. Martha covered her mouth, unable to speak. Mary fell to her knees, tears flowing like unstoppable rivers. The disciples stepped back. Some wept. Others just watched, frozen. The impossible stood before them. Lazarus emerged from the tomb like a shadow clothed in miracle. The wrappings covered his body, symbol of everything that had been conquered. He still didn't speak, but the mere fact that he was there breathing, walking, was already the greatest testimony. Then Jesus said, "Unbind him and let him go." And with those words, the miracle was complete. Hands rushed to remove the linen strips. The smell of death was still there, but fading. Lazarus's face appeared, pale, marked, but alive. His eyes opened slowly like someone waking from an impossible dream. He saw the sky and then he saw the face of the Master. No words were exchanged between the two, just a look, and in that look was more than any speech could contain. A covenant, a revelation, an invisible mark that would forever bind their stories. The crowd pressed in. Some knelt. Others ran to spread the news. The commotion was inevitable. What was once mourning became wonder. What had been timid faith now burst into worship or fear because not all celebrated. The eyes of the Pharisees hidden among the crowd watched in silence. Their hardened hearts saw no miracle. They saw a threat. They saw a man who commanded even death, and who because of that had to be stopped. But in that moment none of it mattered. The universe had paused to hear a shout, a name, and death obeyed. Time bowed before the author of life, and Bethany would never be the same. The scandal. John 12:10. The news spread faster than the wind. In Jerusalem, through alleyways, plazas, the corridors of the Antonia fortress and the temple halls, Lazarus's name returned to the lips of the people. But this time, not as a dead man to be mourned, but as one who had come back from the dead, a living miracle, a walking scandal. The Sanhedrin, rabbis, and teachers of the law gathered in hurried emergency sessions. The doors of the house of Janna were closed, but heated. Voices echoed through the columns. "He raised a dead man," one said. "That's sorcery," another exclaimed. "Or it's the finger of God," murmured a third, more cautious. "Then why does he do it outside the temple? Why among the poor? Why not among us?" The answers were silenced by fear. At the miracle was not only hard to explain, it was dangerous. With Lazarus alive, all boundaries between reason and faith began to crumble. The crowd hungry for hope saw in Jesus more than a rabbi. They saw the Messiah, and that for Israel's leaders was unbearable. Nicodemus, present in silence, watched the debate. His eyes were on the ground, but his heart beat with conflict. What could he say? That the sign was real, that the kingdom was near, that perhaps it was all truly happening. Caiaphas, the high priest, rose from his seat and silenced the group with a gesture. "One miracle alone won't defeat us," he said coldly. "But if this man continues, everyone will believe. And then the Romans will come, take our land, the temple, and our nation will be wiped off the map." Others nodded. The fear wasn't just spiritual, it was political. The miracle of Lazarus threatened not only dogmas but structures, positions, alliances with Rome. The fragile stability the Sanhedrin fought to maintain. It was in that context that the scandal solidified. Silencing Jesus was no longer enough. Now Lazarus was also a problem. A man who walked, ate, slept, and breathed after dying. A daily reminder that death had been defeated. An irrefutable sign the people would not let fade. "We must kill him too," one of the priests suggested, eyes narrowed. "He already died once," another replied. "The people treat him like a legend. If he disappears again, we'll lose control of the narrative." But it was too late. The crowd was already searching for him. Pilgrims came from afar, not just to see Jesus, but to see Lazarus. The empty tomb had become an informal altar. Women touched the stone. Children asked where the man who came back was. In Bethany, Martha and Mary tried to keep the house quiet, but it was impossible. The narrow streets filled with footsteps, voices, curious eyes. Every neighboring house was visited by strangers, disguised Pharisees, undercover Roman soldiers. And there, sitting under the fig tree, was he, Lazarus, alive. But silent, he did not speak of what he saw. He didn't describe the beyond. He didn't recount the moment of return. It was as if the miracle didn't need words. His presence was enough. His silence more eloquent than any sermon. But Lazarus's eyes saw everything. He noticed the sideways glances. He felt the weight of unspoken questions. And he recognized in every Pharisee who approached with false kindness the scent of disguised death. One night Mary warned him, "They're coming for you." He nodded. "I know." Martha wept in silence. She had already lost him once. She didn't want to bury him again. Lazarus didn't respond. There was something in his eyes even his sister couldn't understand. A weight, a peace, like someone who had been where no one returns from, and yet wasn't afraid to go again. That very night when the city gates closed, a man in a dark robe walked among the olive trees of Bethany, a servant of the Sanhedrin. He brought a message unwritten but clear: either hide or die again. The scandal of the miracle now demanded a final response, and once again, heaven seemed silent. The silence of Lazarus. John 11-12. He breathed, walked, ate, slept, but did not speak. From the moment he came out of the tomb wrapped in grave clothes and the awe of a crowd, not a word escaped his lips. No confession, no description, no memory of death, no tale of light of the abyss of the beyond. Lazarus lived, but lived in silence. The house in Bethany, once full of laughter and songs, had now become a sacred and strange place. Martha tried to fill the space with routines, Mary with prayers, but between chores and incense there was always a void, the same silence that surrounded their brother. He was the center of the home and at the same time, a distant visitor. He was there and not many came to see him. Some only out of curiosity, others with faith in their eyes. They hoped to hear about what lies beyond death. They expected a revelation, a vision, a secret from heaven. But Lazarus said nothing. He received everyone with a calm gaze, a look that seemed to see more than human eyes could bear. And so one by one they left disappointed. They said he doesn't want to tell, or maybe he doesn't remember. Others, more reverent, said it must be too sacred to speak of. But the silence weighed. Some feared he had returned incomplete. The people murmured, "Is he still the same?" What if he saw something terrible or something that must never be revealed? The absence of words became scandal, then legend, then fear. Jesus had shouted, "Lazarus, come out." And he came out. But now what? What did it mean to live after death? To be called back when the world had already grieved for you? How does one walk among the living after walking among the dead? Lazarus, above all, seemed to carry a burden. No, one else could see. One night Mary tried to provoke him at the foot of the fire. "Brother, do you remember?" He slowly lifted his eyes. There was tenderness in his gaze, but also pain. She insisted in a whisper, "Was it dark? Did you hear God's voice? Did you cry?" "Nothing. No. Yes. No. No." Just a sigh. Long, deep, as if the soul still wrestled with a memory it didn't want to awaken. One spring afternoon, a group of young disciples came from Jerusalem. They hoped to find a speaker, a prophet, a martyr. One of them, full of excitement, said, "Tell us, Lazarus, what did you see beyond life?" The risen man looked at them. There was no fear, no pride, only a gaze that said, "You wouldn't understand." And they fell silent. In his silence there was something more powerful than words, a kind of testimony that needed no voice. It was his body, his walk, his breathing, the way he looked at trees, the wind, faces, like someone who values every leaf, every breath as one who knows the weight of existence because he has known non-existence. In his silence, Lazarus said, "Life is too sacred a gift to waste on noise." But that silence also isolated him. He walked the roads, but no one walked beside him for long. He visited the market, but voices quieted as he passed. Even the children, usually fearless, watched him with wide eyes as if he were part of another world. And maybe he was. In Bethany, some began to say Lazarus had returned mute. Martha denied it. Mary corrected them, but he didn't need to defend himself. He listened. He understood. He simply didn't want to speak. Perhaps words had lost their flavor, or perhaps they were too small to hold what he carried. In the synagogue, an old Pharisee stared at him and asked, "If you saw the other side, why don't you preach? Why don't you sing psalms to the God who brought you back?" And Lazarus simply closed his eyes because he knew some things lose their power when spoken, and others can only be understood in silence. Time passed and the rumors grew. Some said he was cursed. others that he had become a new prophet. Some wanted to kill him, others to worship him, but he did not respond. One morning he climbed the hill alone. He stayed there for hours watching the valley, the open sky, the sun bathing the earth. And then for the first time he spoke one word just and whispered to the wind with no witnesses, no audience, and yet heaven seemed to hear. If this story is touching you in some way, help us spread it further. Subscribe, like, and share. Your support is the fuel that drives us. Now back to the narrative. Simon's table, John 12:1-2. The sun was beginning to set behind the hills of Bethany. When the first guests arrived, the sound of voices and soft footsteps mixed with the aroma of freshly baked bread, olive oil, and ripe dates. The house of Simon, the former leper, had been prepared for an unusual dinner. A long, simple table, yet full of meaning, awaited those who had, in some way, experienced the miracle. Jesus had returned. Bethany, still murmuring about the resurrection, once again welcomed the man who shouted at death. People gathered discreetly around, not daring to interrupt but paying close attention. Everyone knew something sacred moved within the walls of that house. Inside, the atmosphere was tense and reverent. Martha, as always, was busy. Her quick hands attended to every detail: the wine, the dishes, the bread. Her face showed strain, but her eyes shone with gratitude. Mary, on the other hand, remained seated, silent. Her eyes never left Jesus. Lazarus was there, seated at the table, breathing alive. Simon looked at him with a mixture of awe and unease. Others watched in silence, as if every one of his movements was a reminder that they were witnessing something unexplainable. It was strange to see a man who had been buried now lifting a piece of bread, drinking, chewing, existing. Jesus and Lazarus sat side by side, the author of life and the man pulled from the grip of death. And yet there was no dialogue between them, no tales from beyond, no questions, only presence, dense, sacred. The meal unfolded in glances and silences when suddenly Mary stood up. Without a word, she crossed the room carrying a small alabaster jar. Her hands trembled. Some followed her with their eyes, others looked away, uncomfortable. She knelt before Jesus. The sound of the jar breaking echoed in the room. The fragrance filled the air. Intense, unmistakable, pure nard. Incredibly expensive. With careful hands, Mary anointed Jesus' feet, not as a ritual, but as devotion. Then she let down her hair, an unthinkable gesture for a Hebrew woman, and with it dried the spilled perfume. The room froze. Simon shuddered. One of the disciples muttered something. The scene was beautiful and scandalous at once, but Mary seemed to hear no one else. There was only her and him. Jesus looked at her. His eyes did not scold, did not question. They received, and from the other side of the table Lazarus watched her, she who had wept for him, she who had waited, she who now wept for another, as if already sensing something was about to happen. Perhaps it was intuition, or simply the love that sees what eyes cannot yet grasp. Lazarus said nothing. He simply lowered his head, because in that silent gesture was everything words could not express: gratitude, worship, farewell. Judas, restless, broke the moment. Why wasn't this perfume sold for 300 denarii and the money given to the poor? His voice cut the air like a blade. Jesus, calm, replied, "Leave her alone. She has kept this for the day of my burial. You will always have the poor with you, but you will not always have me." The words floated like a prophecy. Martha stopped serving. Simon looked away. Lazarus raised his head as if hearing a distant thunder. Jesus was speaking of burial. Once again, death hovered over the table. But now it wasn't Lazarus who was threatened. It was the Master himself. Mary remained at his feet, and her tears fell like dew on the anointed feet. They were not tears of despair, but of surrender, as if saying, "If the world doesn't understand, I do." Outside, spies hid in the shadows. The chief priests had already decided it wasn't enough to kill Jesus. Lazarus also had to be silenced. The once dead man was living proof of a power beyond their control. Inside the house, no one knew the sentence had already been written. But Lazarus, in his silence, seemed to feel it. He touched Jesus' shoulder, a slight gesture but filled with all that words could never explain. The resurrected touched the resurrector. And there in that simple house in Bethany, between the bread and the wine, between the perfume and the tears, between silence and scandal, heaven and earth met, and death began to lose its grip. The price of life. John 12:101. The sky over Jerusalem hung heavy like lead. The walls cast long shadows over the alleys, as if hiding more than they revealed. Inside the temple, whispers grew louder. Meetings were no longer public. Doors were closed. Suspicious glances were exchanged, even among brothers of the same tribe. Something had to be done. The elders of the law, the teachers of the Torah, the chief priests, all gathered around a threat they could no longer ignore. A threat that did not shout, did not preach, did not defend itself. A threat that simply breathed. Lazarus, the living man who had been dead. The miracle Jesus had performed, or that the crowds claimed he had now threatened the entire structure of religious power. Because where there is life that cannot be explained, there is fear. And fear like yeast puffed up the hearts of those who called themselves righteous. Many are turning away, murmured one of them. The synagogues are empty when he speaks. And it's not just because of him, added another. It's because of him, the one pulled from death. As long as Lazarus lives, Jesus will be proclaimed. Silence. Then the high priest spoke. Lazarus must die. It was not a metaphor, not a figure of speech. It was a sentence. Arresting the Nazarene was not enough. His most striking miracle still walked through Bethany, and his silent presence was more powerful than any sermon. The news spread through the shadows. Hired men, paid informants, watchful eyes at the village gates. The house of Martha and Mary, once a place of mourning and celebration, now became a field of constant surveillance. Lazarus knew it. No one had to tell him. Simon's look at dinner, Martha's nervousness, Mary's stillness. Everything revealed an uncomfortable truth. Living now was dangerous. Breathing was an act of rebellion. But Lazarus did not flee. He walked the streets, like an ordinary man, though his steps were heavy, not from fear, but from the awareness that the gift he had received now came with a cost. It was a borrowed life, and the world was demanding high interest. Children watched him with reverence. Women whispered as he passed. Men murmured, "It's him, the one who came back." He heard them, all of them, but said nothing. Silence was his protection and his cross. Martha insisted, "We have to leave today." Now Mary said nothing. She only looked at him with eyes that mixed faith and longing, as if she already knew their time together was ending. Lazarus looked at her and then at the sky. "I didn't ask to come back," he said hoarsely for the first time since dinner. The words echoed in the small room like a confession. "But if I came back, it's because there's still a purpose, and I won't run until he says it's time." Mary approached and took his hand. She didn't need to say anything. The gesture was enough. The following night, a group of men approached the house. They stayed in the shadows, watching. They didn't enter, but their eyes cut through the darkness like blades. They were waiting for the right moment. Inside, Lazarus slept, or pretended to. His dreams were restless, faceless figures, voiceless voices. The void of death still lingered, and the presence of the Master felt more distant than ever. At dawn, the men disappeared, but they would return. Everyone knew Bethany would not be safe for much longer. The resurrection of Lazarus had ignited a flame, but the authorities were coming with fierce winds to extinguish it. Because miracles unsettle, because true life threatens those who thrive on control. That same day in the distance, Jesus walked toward Jerusalem, and Lazarus felt the weight of what it meant to be the sign. Because to live after having died is a privilege, but also a sentence. The escape. Night fell over Bethany with the weight of iron. The starless sky looked like an opaque curtain between men and the Most High. The lamps were extinguished early. The doors were shut. The voices went silent. But danger did not sleep. From the top of a nearby hill, silhouettes watched over the village. Informants paid by the Pharisees and scribes moved discreetly among the houses, pretending to be pilgrims or shepherds. Some knocked on doors with innocent questions, others simply observed. All were looking for one man, the one who had been dead, the one who, without saying a single word, shook the power of the Sanhedrin, Lazarus. Inside the house, Martha wept in silence. Mary prepared thin, dry bread, food for the journey. Lazarus sat in the dark barefoot, his feet firm on the gay, cold ground. He knew it was time to leave. The presence of spies was no longer a suspicion. It was a fact. The whispers grew. The name of Lazarus, once spoken with admiration, now came laden with fear. Some neighbors already avoided greeting him. Others gave him quick glances, afraid of being associated with him. The resurrection had been a blessing. Now it was a sentence. "They won't rest until you're dead again," Martha said quietly as she closed the last window. Mary knelt before her brother and held his hands tightly. Jesus fled to the desert before. Now it's your turn to disappear. For a while, Lazarus didn't respond. Silence was still his shield. Not because he had nothing to say, but because death had left an echo in him that still resonated. Speaking felt like defiling something sacred his eyes had seen, something no man could understand, much less those who wanted him dead. That early morning, without making a sound, Lazarus left his house through the back door. He wore a gray tunic, his face partially covered by a cloth. He carried a bag with bread, dates, and a water skin. The staff was light, but his heart was heavy. Mary walked him to the edge of the village. No words were exchanged, only a long embrace, like those who know the reunion may never come. The stones on the path seemed to scream under his feet. With every step, Lazarus felt as if he was leaving a part of himself behind. The city that had seen him die, the home that welcomed him, the faces of his sisters, the scent of incense on the day of the miracle, all drifted away, as if they belonged to another life. And maybe they did. Lazarus was no longer the man he once was. In the following days, he took little-traveled paths, avoiding main routes. He slept in caves under trees or among the rocks of the Judean desert. The wind struck his face like a memory of the tomb. Cold, dry, relentless. In some villages, he overheard rumors. They say the Sanhedrin put a price on his head. They say he's among the Samaritans in disguise. Others swear he returned to the tomb and never came out. Lazarus listened from afar. He didn't correct. He didn't explain. Silence remained his only truth. In the city of Jericho, he saw Roman soldiers talking to local leaders from a distance. He didn't approach. He knew the surveillance didn't come only from the Pharisees. Rome feared uprisings too, and any miracle smelled like rebellion. In the mountains near Engedi, he found refuge among shepherds. One of them, blind in one eye, offered him sour wine and a blanket. He never asked his name. He only said, "There's something about you that gives me chills, like I'm in front of something that shouldn't exist." Lazarus simply nodded because in a way that's exactly what he was. Death had left a mark on him, invisible to the eye but deep in the soul. And now the world around him seemed unsure how to deal with it. A man who died and lives. A sign, a problem, a target. On cold nights he lay looking at the sky. He thought of Jesus. Where was he? What was he doing? Did he know what was happening in Bethany? Would he call him again? But the sky remained silent, as if the time of miracles had ceased, and only the time of persecution remained. Once seeing a child playing with stones near a spring, Lazarus smiled. A small, almost imperceptible smile. But for a moment he remembered life. Simple joy, light laughter, and why he still walked. He wasn't fleeing death. He knew it well. He was fleeing perhaps from those who had never touched it, but who tried to control the lives of others for fear of losing their own. When he reached a secluded cave in the mountains of Tekoa, he sat and took a deep breath. His skin was burned by the sun, his clothes dirty, his body tired, but his eyes still sore, and in his heart, a certainty was growing. The journey was not over. He had been called back by a voice greater than death, and as long as that voice remained, he would continue even in exile, even in silence. Because life, true life, does not obey the decrees of men. And Lazarus knew this better than anyone. The path of the exile. The sun rose like a blade over the stone hills. Judea in its cruel silence offered no easy shade. The desert wind blew hot and harsh, lifting fine particles that clung to the skin, as if the earth itself were trying to stop those who dared to cross it. It was there, among the rocks and thorns, that Lazarus walked. His feet were worn, covered in dust and wounds. His tattered cloak fluttered in the wind, dry and patched. He followed paths known only to shepherds and smugglers, forgotten roads where Roman presence was rare and the land hostile. The valleys between Edom and the Negev had seen generations of exiles before him, and now Lazarus joined that invisible line of wanderers. He carried no map, only memories and a name he could no longer say. With every step, the past seemed further away. Bethany, Mary, Martha. Even the moment of the miracle faded like an illusion. The tomb had been conquered, but something within him was still buried. Something he didn't yet understand. He had been brought back to life. Yes, but for what? To flee? To hide like a criminal? Or to carry a secret no one dared to understand? As he crossed the Z Canyon, he saw the remains of an old watchtower. He stopped there, drank the last of his water, looked around. Nothing but stones, twisted shrubs, and the desert's unending buzz. The silence was absolute, but inside him there was a constant noise, not of fear, but of an existential void that tore at the soul. In Ma, an old shepherd took him in for a night. He didn't ask his name. He only pointed to the stable and offered hard bread and a bowl of goat milk. Around the fire they spoke little, but the old man said something that stayed with him. Many walk this land, some out of revenge, others out of fear, but those touched by the eternal. They walk without knowing where they're going until the ground itself gives them an answer. The next morning Lazarus continued, but now with a different look. He was beginning to understand. The escape wasn't just physical, it was internal. Every path in the desert carved a trench within him, and every mountain crossed tore down another wall of what he once was. In the region of Arad, he slept among black stones. The night's cold made him shiver. His eyes didn't close easily. It was as if he feared that by sleeping he might not wake again, or worse, that he would return to the same place from which he had been called 4 days later. There was a strange fear within him, not of death but of God's silence. In the darkness he remembered the voice. "Lazarus, come out." It thundered through his bones, a command that pulled him from death but didn't give him a clear path. Why him? Why live again? In Islat, near the border of Edom's lands, he heard rumors of caravans being intercepted. The temple leaders had extended their watch to the far reaches. Lazarus' name still caused unrest, and now even beyond Judea, he was a shadow that stirred discomfort. There, with the Red Sea in the distance and the hot wind cutting his skin, he realized there was no going back. His story no longer belonged to Jerusalem's walls or the Sanhedrin's halls. It was a narrative that began in a tomb and continued along roads even the prophets had not foreseen. One day, crossing a dry riverbed, he stopped. The ground was cracked. The marks of ancient water were still there, a reminder that even the driest places were once living rivers. He knelt and ran his hand over the earth. He wept, not out of pain, but recognition. He had become that, a dry bed where water once flowed, a life that had already died, a body that walked yet searched for purpose. His feet kept going. The encounter with death. Psalm 88. The fever came like a thief without warning as evening fell. Lazarus' body, already exhausted from long journeys, gave in to the heat and fatigue. He found refuge in a forgotten cave on the hillside, far from any village where not even the echo seemed to reach the heavens. There, surrounded by damp stones and dense shadows, the man who had once been called from death would face his limit again. Sweat ran down his forehead. His chest gasped. Breathing, once steady, had become a struggle against emptiness. Lazarus trembled. His half-open eyes saw figures dancing on the cave walls, shapes that defied the logic of light. In one corner the fire had already gone out. In another his soaked tunic clung to his thin, frail body, as if the fabric knew there was no strength left within. The hours turned into eternities. Then the visions came, disconnected fragments. Mary's voice calling him. Martha's steady gaze holding back tears. Jesus' face not smiling or authoritative, but with eyes full of sorrow. And then silence. A silence not of this world. A silence heavier than 1,000 screams. He tried to cry out, but no word came. His cracked, dry lips moved in vain. God's name tried to form in his mind, but it felt distant, buried beneath layers of spiritual dust. Then everything faded. The light, the cave, the pain. Only darkness remained, a living darkness. Lazarus felt himself floating between two worlds. It was not like the first death. There was no tunnel, no voice calling him outward, no memory of the touch that made him rise, only an absence, his absence. And there, in the midst of that absence, terror. Because if the first death had been conquered by a divine cry, this one seemed invincible in its silence. The veil between worlds did not tear. It merely trembled cruelly, as if mocking his thirst for answers. Lord, where are you now? But not even the question found an echo. He remembered the psalm he once heard in the synagogues. I am counted among those who go down to the pit, cast off among the dead, like those who lie in the grave. That ancient prayer now seemed his own. A lament without music, a psalm without answer. He was overtaken by cold, not the cold of night, but the cold of the soul. He felt naked, purposeless, as if life had been returned to him without a map. And now finally it demanded a price. Was this the weight of having been resurrected? To live without meaning until the body once again surrendered without glory, without witnesses. The images returned, the tomb, the burial cloths, the eyes of all fixed on him as he stepped out. The shame of living without knowing why. And the final question, what if death had never really left him? A distant thunder split the sky. Rain began to fall slowly like tears from heaven. Water ran down the cave walls, and Lazarus, lying on the ground, barely felt the drops on his burning skin. His eyes closed. His consciousness wavered. But amid the delirium, a faint glimmer appeared. Not light, just a reflection. Something beyond understanding. As if the absence wasn't total. As if even in the abyss, there was a thread, a breath, a forgotten memory. There was no voice, no miracle, only the persistence of something that refused to die within him, a remnant of faith. Lazarus did not rise that night, but he did not depart either. Death surrounded him, touched his forehead, threatened to take him. But it stepped back as if it recognized in that body a sacred sign, an invisible mark. When the sun returned, timid and golden, the body still breathed, weak, but alive. Lazarus slowly opened his eyes, and for the first time in a long while he wept, not out of fear, but out of understanding. The absence of God, he felt, was not rejection, it was maturing, it was desert, it was learning. Death came again, but it did not win, and now he knew not every miracle is light. Sometimes the true miracle is surviving God's silence and still believing the face of the Messiah. John 11:25. The fever had begun to subside, days still blurred between light and shadow, between memory and dream. Lazarus's weakened body lay on stretched skins in an improvised shelter carved into stone. Solitude was no longer an enemy. It had become a mirror. But something persisted, an image, a face that would not let him rest. It was him. Jesus, not as he saw him in Bethany, surrounded by crowds or seated at Simon's table. Not as the teacher who taught in parables or touched the blind. No, the face that haunted him in his fevered dreams was different, closer, more terrible, more real. It was the face that called him from death. In the fragments of memory, Lazarus could still grasp the moment of his resurrection, repeated like an endless echo. He didn't hear the voice. He felt it. He didn't see the light. He was enveloped by it. And at the center of it all, that gaze, firm, calm, piercing, the gaze of a God who loves but also demands. I am the resurrection and the life. Those words now burned more than the desert sun. He had been pulled from the world of the dead, not to hide, but to live with a weight no other man carried, the weight of having returned. But why? Why him? Why Lazarus of all people? He was not a scribe, not a priest, not a chosen disciple, just an ordinary man, a homeowner, brother to 2 pious women, a friend, yes, but not a leader, not a martyr, not a prophet. And yet he was the chosen one. He relived that afternoon in Bethany like someone trying to decipher an ancient dream. The cries, the people, Martha, Mary, the stench of the tomb, the stone being rolled away, the shame of a wrapped body exposed to all, and the command, "Come out." But what if he hadn't come out? What if he had preferred the silence of death over the shame of living without explanation? Lazarus shut his eyes tight. The face was still there, floating in his thoughts, unmistakable. He saw every line on Jesus' face, every crease of compassion, every shadow of weariness, every spark of eternity in human eyes. It wasn't a common memory. It was a seal engraved on his soul. At times he wondered if that image was truly a memory or a prophecy. In his dreams, Christ's face didn't age, didn't fade. It drew closer each time, sometimes with tenderness, other times with urgency. In one of those fevered visions, the Master came near without saying a word. He simply looked. And in that look, Lazarus understood what he had been avoiding since the escape. The resurrection was not the end. It was the calling. Yes, he had been called for something. But for what? Living in hiding could not be the answer. Forgetting the miracle was impossible. Denying what he had seen would be lying with his very existence. But he still didn't know where to begin. The face of the Messiah tormented him, not out of fear but for lack of understanding. Lazarus sat up with effort. His body still ached, but his spirit felt awake. He took a piece of charcoal and began to draw on the stone before him. Not words, just strokes, circles, lines. He was trying, without realizing it, to draw the face he saw. He wanted to give form to the invisible, but he couldn't because that face didn't belong to the earth. It was more than flesh, more than light, more than memory. It was the reflection of purpose, and perhaps that was what ate at him inside. To live a resurrected life without knowing why was like carrying a cup full of water without knowing who was thirsty. Lazarus lay back again, eyes fixed on the cave entrance. Outside the world went on, but within him, a new world was being born. A world made of silence and questions, but also of a presence that never left. He still had no answers, but now he knew the right question. It was no longer why me, but for whom. The image of Jesus returned now gentler, more alive. The Messiah didn't demand explanations. He offered a path, and maybe that was the first step. Recognizing that the second life only begins when the first one ends, and Lazarus's first life had indeed ended in the tomb. What remained now was to discover what to do with that new breath he had been given, and this time, there would be no turning back. The voice of the desert. The desert does not respond. It only listens. The stone's silent since the beginning of the world. No secrets that men have forgotten. And it was there where absolute silence reigns and time crawls like a snake in the sun, that Lazarus found an old man wrapped in dust and mystery. He appeared from the shadows of the rock like a living specter. Rough tunic, white beard, sunken eyes that seemed to pierce the skin and touch the soul. He did not say his name. He did not ask for his. He simply extended his hand with an inviting gesture, and Lazarus, exhausted and hungry, followed him. The shelter was simple, a narrow cave, a jug of water, dried dates, and a small fire shielded from the wind. The old man did not speak much, but when he did, his words seemed drawn from the depths of the earth as if they belonged to another era. He recited ancient verses from the prophets, fragments of sacred texts that the world had forgotten, but that in the corners of Qumran still survived the sands. Lazarus listened in silence like someone who not only hears, but drinks. The old man belonged to an ancient community, the Essenes, men who had left Jerusalem to seek purity in the desert. They rejected the corrupted temple, fasted, studied the scrolls, and awaited the coming of two anointed ones, a priest and a king. They kept secrets but did not seek power. They lived like shadows on the margins of history, and yet they shaped the spirit of the age. At night, by the light of the embers, the old man would read, not from visible scrolls, but from memory, as if each word were engraved on his chest. He spoke of judgment, repentance, justice, the separation between the children of light and the children of darkness. But there was tenderness in his voice, like someone who knows human pain and bears it with reverence. One night he looked at Lazarus for a long time before saying, "The righteous will live by faith. But faith, my son, demands death, not of the body, but of pride." Lazarus trembled. Those words resonated too intimately. He had already died. But had he died to himself? Had he risen only in the flesh and not in the heart, in that shared solitude? The old man's words pierced deeper than the desert cold. A calling began to form within him. Not a calling to return, but to understand. The next morning, as the sun dyed the dunes gold, the old man handed Lazarus a fragment of parchment. The handwriting was precise, firm, and read, "Prepare in the desert the way of the Lord. Make straight in it a highway for our God." It was Isaiah, but it sounded like a personal whisper, as if that ancient prophecy now belonged to his destiny. Lazarus tucked the parchment into the worn folds of his tunic. Then at dusk he sat outside the cave. The wind blew, the mountains echoed in silence, and for the first time since he fled Bethany, he felt part of something. Not healed, not whole, but part. The old man approached once more, this time slowly and firmly. He stopped at his side and murmured, "The dead who return no longer belong to the world of men, but they are signs like torches lit in dark places. You have been called to see, not to hide." Lazarus looked at him, eyes filled with tears. No words came from his lips, but his heart, yes, was beginning to respond. He had understood the face of the Messiah. Now, through the voice of the desert, he was beginning to understand his calling, the hidden name. There was a man who had no name. At least that was how he arrived in that dusty village on the outskirts of Jericho. Tired, scorched by the sun, and silence. He introduced himself only as the traveler. He did not lie, but he did not tell the truth, either. His eyes carried more than the worn sandals or tattered tunic could explain. The stories, however, traveled faster than the wind. Voices whispered in the plazas, in the synagogues, among the markets. There is a man who came back from the dead. He saw the world beyond. He was called by his name and came out of the tomb. Some say he is in hiding. Others swear they've seen him wandering the roads. Lazarus listened, always from afar, always in silence. In a narrow alley he heard a child repeat the tale the people told, and the dead man rose and walked among the living. But his voice stayed in the tomb. Lazarus leaned against the stone wall. For a moment time swirled like sand in the wind. He saw himself once more wrapped in burial cloths, wrapped in the scent of death, wrapped in the command of someone who had conquered the impossible. But there, in that moment, he was just a common face among many, a survivor with no place. To survive, he needed to deny his own name. The name was a risk, a target, a burden. The name the Master had shouted before all was now sought by the very ones who planned the crucifixion. Lazarus knew he was living evidence of what many wanted to erase. Miracles in times of power are crimes. That is why he became a foreigner. In every village he passed through, he adopted a new accent, a new story, a new silence. Changed names were nothing new among the persecuted. As the rabbis taught, during days of oppression and massacre, many hid their identity to protect themselves and their own. The Talmud speaks of survivors who changed cities and names as a form of silent resistance. Lazarus now was one of them. But the true name was never erased. It burned within him like covered embers. When he prayed in secret, he did not say, "My God." He said, the God who called me. When he touched his chest, it felt as if the echo of that voice, Lazarus, come out, still resonated in his bones. No disguise could silence that calling. Once an old Egyptian merchant offered him bread and rest. That night, sitting by the clay lamp, the man spoke bluntly, I've seen you before, or someone like you. It's not just the face. It's the silence, the absence of fear. Men who have died and returned have that look. But they hide the name because they know the name kills them. Lazarus only smiled, neither confirming nor denying. The merchant continued, You don't have to say it. Just promise me that when your time comes again, you won't stay silent. Because names can be forgotten, but testimonies cannot. Those words followed him in the days to come like an inseparable shadow. In another city, a woman called him Ben Alphas, trying to guess his origin. In another, he was mistaken for one of John's disciples. In all of them, he disappeared before the sun completed its cycle. He never left a trace. But what is hidden on the outside one day is revealed within. On a morning of wind and stars, kneeling among stones, Lazarus finally whispered his own name. No one heard except God. And there, beneath the mantle of night, he did not feel threatened. He felt whole. He was not just the resurrected man. He was the man who had been called. His name might be hidden from men, but it could never be forgotten by heaven. If this content has stirred something in your heart, click subscribe, leave a like, and share it with someone who needs it. You are part of this mission. Let's continue the story. The message. John 18:12. The desert has no walls, but it has ears. That morning, the sun had barely risen when the caravan appeared on the horizon. Dust and voices mixed with the creaking of wheels. Lazarus watched from afar, leaning against a dry olive tree, his eyes squinting in the light. The travelers came from the north, and he recognized that kind of urgency, the kind too heavy for words. As they approached, one of the men dismounted from his donkey and asked, panting, This hermit, is he the one they called the one who returned? Lazarus did not respond. He didn't need to. His silence was answer enough. That's when the news dropped like a stone in his soul. The Nazarene has been arrested. Judas turned him in. They took him to the Sanhedrin. The messenger's voice faltered. The city is in chaos. Soldiers are everywhere. Some disciples fled. Others disappeared. Lazarus felt his muscles tighten. A chill ran down his back. The world once again trembled beneath his feet. Jesus, imprisoned. The master who had called him from death was now being led by men toward it. He didn't ask for details. He didn't want to know the traitor's name. He knew it wasn't just a man, but time itself that had betrayed him. The time of miracles was ending. The time of darkness had begun. The caravan departed, leaving behind echoes and dust. But something stirred within Lazarus. Not despair, not rage. It was a calling, an invisible force pulling him back to where it had all begun. I must go, he told the older who had hosted him for weeks. The old man only nodded with his eyes. He had already expected it. He who flees from his mission, said a scroll among the Qumran texts, ends up finding it again at every bend in the road. But how to return? Jerusalem was a trap. His name still circulated among the priests like a wound that refused to heal. He was the dead man who had not stayed dead, and that was enough for them to want him buried again, this time without resurrection. Every step toward the holy city was a defiance of survival itself. Returning meant walking into risk, into judgment, into the sword. But how could he stay? The man who had saved him was now in chains. The one who had shouted his name at the tomb was now being silenced by accusations. How could Lazarus fold his arms while the righteous one was condemned? The dilemma burned in his chest like the sun that had scorched his shoulders during his days in the desert. Fear said, "Stay hidden." But love said, "Go." At sunset, Lazarus prepared. He dressed in simple clothes, tied his feet with worn sandals, covered his face with a cloak. He didn't want to be recognized, but he didn't want to hide either. The truth lay between those two extremes. He was no longer the same, but he was no hero. He was a man with a debt. Night fell over the hills as he crossed the first mark on the road back to Jerusalem. The road was old, but his steps were new. At every turn, memories rose like ghosts. Martha weeping, Mary in silence, the cold body, the shout, "Lazarus, come out!" Now it was Jesus who was shouting, but no one was listening. What if that prison was the end? What if the Messiah, the Anointed One, the Word, were to die? Lazarus stopped, his eyes fixed on the starless sky. He thought of running. He thought of turning back. He thought of disappearing. But the silence that had lived inside him since the tomb spoke louder. There was no turning back. The next morning he would blend in among the Passover travelers. He would use another name. He would avoid glances, but he would be there close, even if invisible. The city where he had died would be the same where he would see the one who gave him life die. The empty throne. John 19:30. Lazarus heard before he saw. The news came like a dry wind, carrying words crumbled by grief. He's dead. It is finished. The righteous one has passed. The rumors mingled with the cries in the streets, with the muffled sobs of women, with the hurried steps of those fleeing before sunset. But for Lazarus, every word weighed more than the stones that seal a tomb. Jesus was dead. The same Jesus who looked into the abyss and called his name. The same Jesus who said, "I am the resurrection and the life." The same Jesus who had wept for him. Now he was the one who lay still. Lazarus was near the city among the olive trees, hidden with other pilgrims. He did not dare approach the cross. His face was still remembered, his presence still a scandal. But his heart was there at the foot of the wood. Some said he cried out something before dying. Others said he expired in silence, but one phrase echoed like a lament among the hidden disciples. It is finished. Finished. What kind of end was this? Was it defeat, destiny, or a victory no one understood? Lazarus fell to his knees behind a rock far from the guard's eyes, his hands dug into the earth. He tried to pray, but no words came. There was nothing to say. How do you thank a man who gave you back your life and now gave up his own? A tear fell. Then another and another. It was a different kind of weeping. Not just pain. It was a collapse. A fracture in the axis of the world. The death that had come for everyone now reached even the author of life. Lazarus remembered the moment he opened his eyes in the tomb. The jolt of light, the warmth in his lungs, the touch on his fingers, the name, his name spoken with divine authority. Now the one who had spoken it was silent. The word had gone quiet. The afternoon wore on. They said the skies had darkened. The temple veil was torn. Some soldiers spoke of earthquakes and open tombs. But Lazarus did not want miracles. Not at that moment. He wanted to understand why. Why would the God who conquered death now allow himself to be conquered by it? The following hours were a blur. The body was hastily taken down, wrapped in linen, buried in a garden, a new tomb for a rejected king. The throne of the cross was now empty. But so was Lazarus's heart. He wandered the hills aimless. Bethany was too far, and Jerusalem too close. Night fell, and with it the darkness inside him deepened. There was no voice. There was no light, only silence. Lazarus lay on the hard ground among stones and shrubs. He looked at the cloudy sky. The moon did not dare shine. It was as if creation itself was in mourning. He thought of his first death, of the cold, of the darkness, of the emptiness. It was strange. Lying there on the earth, he felt more dead than before, because in that cave he had been awakened by a voice. Now there was no one to call him. Lazarus closed his eyes. The world had collapsed again. The third day, John 20:18. The day was just beginning to awaken when the whispers began to spread. At first they came as timid rumors like dust carried by the wind. The tomb is empty. The stone has been rolled away. He is not there. Lazarus heard it from the top of the hill where the cold still bit the skin and dew covered the stones. He had been sitting withdrawn in silence since the day of the death. He had remained quiet even to those who sought him out. The world spoke too much. But that morning, one phrase pierced him like an arrow. The Master is no longer in the tomb. Lazarus's heart did not race. He didn't shout. He simply knew, as if something inside him long asleep had whispered, "I told you." He rose slowly, his body still tired, his soul in a state of awe. The women were among the first to tell. Mary Magdalene, out of breath, spoke with wide eyes and trembling hands. They took the body. He is gone. Peter and John ran to see. Lazarus remained still. He didn't need to run. He didn't need to see. He already knew. Because that emptiness, that silence in the tomb was not absence. It was announcement. A promise fulfilled. Some said the soldiers had been bribed. Others spoke of theft. But among the disciples there was something more. A restlessness in their eyes, a tremble in their movements, something greater than fear. Hope. Peter returned pale-faced. John in silence could barely hold back his tears. And among them the same phrase, "The cloths were there, but the body was not." Lazarus walked to a solitary fig tree and leaned on it. He fell to his knees, his eyes filled with tears. But it wasn't sadness. It was awe. It was reverence. He remembered every step he took as he emerged from his tomb, the warmth that returned to his chest, the shout that awakened him. Now the shout was different, not a command but a victory. Life, everyone thought, ended at the rolled-away stone in the dark cave in the scent of death. But there, on the third day, the whole world was learning a new truth. Life begins where men say it ends. Hours passed and the reports multiplied. He appeared to Mary. He spoke to her in the garden. He called her by name. Lazarus closed his eyes, trying to imagine the voice, the gaze, the touch. Suddenly he saw himself again in that dark grotto in Bethany. And he heard Lazarus. "Oh, come out." It was the same voice, the same authority. But now it resounded for everyone. Death had lost its power. There was no turning back. The stone had been rolled away from the tomb, from the heart, from history. Lazarus stood up. He still didn't have the courage to go down to Jerusalem. It wasn't time yet. Those seeking to arrest him still roamed the streets, but inside him something had been lit. An unspoken certainty, a flame no death could extinguish. He looked to the sky. The third day was not just another dawn. It was the beginning of the end of death. The testimony, Acts 4:20, the silence of Lazarus had always been heavier than any word. Since the day he emerged from the tomb, he walked among the living as a mystery. Watched, feared, respected. Many wanted to know what he had seen. Few dared to ask. But that day, something changed. It was night. A fire crackled at the center of a small group gathered outside the walls of Jerusalem. Fear hovered over them all. Rumors said the Nazarene's followers were being hunted. Some had already been arrested, others threatened, but no one scattered. There, in the midst of the darkness, the disciples searched for light. Lazarus was among them, sitting in the shadows listening to the stories. Peter spoke with passion, John with tears in his eyes. Mary Magdalene described the moment she heard her name in the garden. Everyone gave testimony. And then the group fell silent. All eyes turned to him. The man who had defeated death. The one whose story everyone told, but who had never spoken of it himself. "Lazarus," John said softly, "you never told us what happened. Over there." A heavy silence fell over the group. The crackling of the fire was the only sound. Lazarus took a deep breath. His gaze drifted into the flames. His fingers trembled slightly on the edge of his cloak, and he spoke. "I don't know how." "Much time passed," he began in a voice. "For you it was 4 days. For me there were no days. No time. Only absence." He closed his eyes, his face marked by the weight of what he carried. "I saw no gates. I heard no songs. I met no one, just silence, a void darker than night, a forgetting." The eyes around him widened. Mary held back her tears. And then he continued. "I came a sound, a call like thunder within me. My name Lazarus, as if someone tore the veil between worlds. He paused. The fire reflected in his wet pupils. And I came back, not by my will, but because he called me. The voice of the Son of God reached where nothing else could. The flames trembled as if dancing to the rhythm of those words. When I opened my eyes, there was no light, only pain. The pain of living again, of breathing, of remembering. I heard cries, weeping, and above all him. Lazarus looked at each of them one by one. Jesus was there waiting, weeping, not out of weakness but out of love. He brought me back, but not to live as before. He brought me to testify, to remind the world that he holds authority over death. Peter murmured, "Amen," eyes wet. John pressed a hand to his chest. I stayed silent for a long time, Lazarus admitted, because my words felt too small, because I feared making sacred something that is beyond language. But today I know that to remain silent is to deny. He leaned forward, eyes locked on the group. I died, and he called me back. I was in darkness, and he brought me to light. I was dust, and he made me live. His tone rose not in volume, but in power. How could I not speak now? How could I hide what I've seen, what I've felt, what I know? Everyone was silent, but it was a different silence. Not of doubt, but of reverence. Lazarus raised his face to the sky. He lives, and I am proof of it. Not just because I returned, but because I was changed. Death no longer has dominion over me, nor over any of us. And then with a quiet, firm voice he concluded, "For we cannot stop speaking about what we have seen and heard." The disciples looked at one another. Something had changed that night. Not just because of what was said, but because of who said it. Lazarus's silence had ended, and his voice now echoed louder than any miracle. The second death, Hebrews 2:14-15. Time spares no one, not even those who have already returned from death. Lazarus's hair had turned silver. His skin, marked by deep lines, resembled soil that had known both rain and drought. His hands, once steady, now trembled while holding a clay cup. But his eyes still held the glow of the day death bowed to a voice. Lazarus no longer walked long distances. He sat in the shade of an olive tree in front of his simple home, gazing at the hills of Bethany. Martha cared for him with calm affection. Mary at times sang psalms softly in the background, but his body revealed the approaching end. This time, there was no fever, no urgency, only a tiredness that grew day by day, a subtle invitation to eternity. One afternoon, a disciple visited him. He was young, full of questions, carrying an unfinished scroll. "Father Lazarus," he said, sitting at his feet, "of what is death for someone who has known it twice?" Lazarus smiled, a smile blending memory and revelation. "The first death," he said softly, "was like falling into a soundless abyss. There was no pain, but there was no presence either, only absence, and forgetting so deep, even my own name seemed to dissolve." He closed his eyes for a moment. "The second is different. It no longer frightens me. Not because I know what lies beyond, but because I know who waits for me beyond." The young disciple took notes, captivated. "And you are not afraid?" Lazarus shook his head. "I'm not, because I learned that death rules only over those who do not know life." A reverent silence fell. The olive leaves swayed gently as if they too were listening. "When he called me out of the tomb," Lazarus continued, "he didn't just return me to the world. He returned me to purpose, to meaning. Since then, I never truly belonged to time. I only walked within it, waiting for the day when at last it would let me go." The young man hesitated, then asked, "What do you hope for now?" Lazarus looked to the sky. A bird slowly crossed the golden line of sunset. "I hope to see the face of the one who called me. Not in visions, not in dreams, but with eyes freed from dust." He placed a hand over his chest. "This time there will be no voice saying, 'Lazarus, come out.' No stones rolled away, no astonished eyes. This time I will go in silence, and I will carry no doubts." The disciple wiped his eyes without realizing. That man who spoke as if made of time and eternity all at once was saying goodbye. "Will you write down these words?" asked Lazarus. "Yes, Father, I will, so that others may know. Then write this: Death holds power only until it meets the greater love. After that, it's just a crossing." In the distance, Mary called gently for dinner. Lazarus rose slowly, helped by the young man. His steps were short but firm. That night he did not sleep. He lay down, eyes open, staring at the ceiling. He softly whispered David's psalms, words once of lament, now of comfort. When the sun rose, Martha found her brother in peace, his face serene, his lips slightly parted in a faint smile. There was no sign of pain nor of struggle. Lazarus was gone this time, not to return, but also he would never need to return. The echo of life. Philippians 9:2. The body of Lazarus rested wrapped in linen, his hands crossed over his chest, his face serene, his mouth slightly open as if about to speak one last revelation. This time there were no crowds, no public commotion, only the close ones, those who had walked with him after the resurrection and heard his few but profound words. Among them, one of the youngest apostles whispered, "He didn't die. He departed as one who obeys a call." Another replied, "He left as one who already knew the way." Lazarus had become more than a name. To many, he was a sign. To others, a mystery, and to those who knew him, he was living testimony that death does not triumph where Christ reigns. For years his silence spoke. When he finally chose to tell his story, his words were not written on golden scrolls, but in the souls of those who heard him. Each simple phrase carried the weight of someone who had known nothingness, and then the light. In a small house far from the bustle of Jerusalem, disciples and followers gathered to remember. There were no crowns, no hierarchies, only memories. He used to say, shared a woman, her eyes tearful, "The true life begins when the world thinks it ends." All nodded silently. Lazarus' words began to spread like seeds cast to the wind in Antioch, in Phoenicia, in the communities of Asia Minor. Missionaries repeated his accounts not as legends but as revelations. In the midst of persecution, he was cited as living proof that Christ was greater than the grave. Polycarp of Smyrna, years later, would write to the faithful in Philippi, "For if even the one who was swallowed by the tomb returned by the word of the Lord, what greater testimony do we seek? The righteous live not by breath but by the promise." Epistle to the Philippians 9:2. The name of Lazarus did not appear in theological treatises, but on the lips of the persecuted. It was spoken among chains, in catacombs, at tables of bread and wine. He lived twice, so that we might understand eternity. One day, a young Christian being led to martyrdom said before dying, "I saw the tomb where they buried Lazarus, and if he rose, I too will rise." The echo of Lazarus' life was not made of great deeds. It was made of presence, of endurance, of quiet, unshakable faith. And in heaven, perhaps as the angels sing, a figure walks among them in silence, with a gentle smile on his lips, not out of pride, but knowing that his life and his second death were not in vain. The stone sealed his body, but not his story. His flesh rested, but his legacy bloomed. Because the life Jesus offered was not a return to what was. It was a leap to what will be. The story of Lazarus does not end in a tomb. It continues wherever a heart believes that death has lost its crown. And now more stories are appearing on screen. Click to dive deeper into the mysteries and promises of Scripture. Thank you for walking with us this far. May this journey have strengthened your faith. I'll see you in the next story.